Before we get started, I just want to say this video is just for fun. I'm not trying to do this to trash the work of Digital Eclipse or any other person who's working on arcade emulation. I appreciate their work. I just want to kind of point out the differences between the arcade versus the emulation, just to point out how difficult this game actually is to get emulated. First off, I'd really like to give Digital Eclipse some credit for fixing a lot of stuff that MAME emulation had gotten wrong. A few quick examples would be the timer had green dots in MAME, the player on the right side of the screen would have holes in their character model, the game would occasionally crash when you beat Shinnok. None of this stuff appears in the Legacy Collection emulation. In fact, they actually improved the emulation quite a bit. The 4x rendering makes the game look pretty good on an HD LCD screen. And the Legacy Collection even has a feature the arcade doesn't. The hidden character Meat can actually appear in the game's endings. I had a lot of fun with this when I figured that out and made a compilation of all the endings starring Meat. I got a good laugh out of it. I'll leave a link to that in the description. If you beat the game with Meat on arcade hardware, it just crashes and reboots. So now let's get on to the things that are different from the arcade hardware when run on the Legacy Collection. The speed of the game feels a little bit off. Let's start where the game starts, the Attract mode. It shows an overall issue not just with the Legacy Collection, but emulation of older games on new hardware in general. To be clear, this isn't a game-breaking problem, but more something I find interesting. There's only a short time where the Attract mode runs in a linear path, so it's almost impossible to really show how far off the game can get here. Where the difference in speed seems to mostly come from is what I assume is the load times. We don't get a visual cue that the game is loading, but it definitely is pulling information from the game's ROMs at the end of scenes and or during the black screens between them. Before I go any further, I want to point out this happens with lots of games I've observed. It's primarily newer arcade games from the mid-90s and moving forward. I'm a huge fan of Killer Instinct. That is another game when emulated runs faster than the arcade hardware. When Arcade 1UP released their KI cabinet, I compared not only the Arcade 1UP to the original hardware, but I also compared MAME too. I'd say the arcade fell far behind, but in reality the emulation moved faster than the hardware it emulated. I'm not going to pretend I have the answer, but I do have a theory as to why this happens. At the time of these games' release, they were likely running cutting-edge hardware. Game manufacturers could afford to use high-end hardware to make the best-looking games possible, since these would be money-making machines. The more money they invested in the hardware, the more likely it would attract people to put money into the machine. These games were priced around $5,000 new, at least that's from the best information I could gather on the internet. While this hardware was highly impressive at the time, it's nothing compared to what we have nowadays. Even a Nintendo Switch is miles ahead of that hardware. Data transfer speeds have also risen exponentially since the mid-90s. My theory is they can emulate the hardware but cannot emulate real-world conditions for that hardware. Conditions where the on-screen activity is causing the hardware to chug and trying but failing to keep its frame rate at a constant speed. Emulating data transfer speeds might also be affected by this as well. When the game is pulling information from the virtual ROMs or the virtual hard drive in the case of Killer Instinct, I believe it's pulling it at the maximum possible speed that hardware was rated for. In reality, that hardware couldn't always transfer the data that quickly with other things going on. This is just my theory, and I'd love if someone who knows more about this could comment with what might be the real answer. There's also a chance some of the speed change is related to the frames per second. From what I've found, Mortal Kombat 4 ran at 50 frames per second on the arcade hardware. The collection is saying it's running at 60 frames a second. This might also account for the speed difference in this case. Since we're talking about speed changes, a great example of the hardware chugging to display the gameplay is shown in several places. Body explosions and the fire or green curtain put up by Scorpions and Liu Kang's fatalities all run way too fast. It's really hard to criticize this since the speed isn't always consistent on the arcade hardware either. The only thing that is consistent on the arcade is the varying degrees of slowness. The Legacy Collection can display all of it at full speed every time. This isn't game breaking, but personally I love seeing the old hardware slowing down. It was almost like we got to see exactly how hard they were pushing the already impressive hardware to its max. I find it very interesting because I don't think we would appreciate this with modern games. If the latest Call of Duty game was dropping to half of its advertised frame rate, most would be put off by that. Let me know what you think of this in the comments. Do you prefer the modern emulation where nothing slows down? Or do you like seeing the slower frame rate when the hardware is just working its butt off to show us all these cool body explosions and fire and stuff on the screen? There's also another literally game-breaking glitch. It is Reptile's acid vomit fatality. This fatality can actually crash the arcade game, but it seems to happen far more often on the Legacy Collection. I can't figure out exactly what causes it to happen, but it seems to happen more often if you do it against Scorpion. Another thing that seems weird about the collection is the difficulty also feels off. Now this is going to be pretty much impossible to prove. A good example of proof of this, for me at least, is last night I did an arcade live stream where I played my Mortal Kombat 4 cabinet, and I was actually talking about the difficulty feeling off in the Legacy Collection. During that stream I decided I wanted to try to beat the game on the hardest difficulty on the hardest tower. When I went into the arcade service menus, I found I accidentally left my arcade cabinet on max difficulty for probably a month or more without even knowing it. I had been playing it, it felt pretty fine. I guess I just got better at the game possibly, but I had no idea it was actually on the hardest setting. That said, when I play the Legacy Collection on the easiest setting, or even easy, it still feels like it's beyond the hardest setting of the arcade. This could also be a combination of speed changes in the emulation, and me not being used to playing with a controller instead of arcade controls. Maybe it's a perfect storm of that just making my skills feel a little bit more dull in the game.
Wins. Fatality.
Let's move on to comparing the Legacy Collection's input lag against the arcade. I tested this before on a YouTube short and was rightfully called out for not using game mode on my TV. This was something I honestly didn't even think of, so I wanted to try it again to get a more fair look. So here's my test setup this time. A gaming monitor set to 120Hz refresh rate. I'm using a wired controller and a wireless controller against the real arcade hardware. I'm using the same camera and the same settings on the camera to record both screens. During editing, I synced up the button presses as close as I could get, not only by syncing the presses frame by frame, but also by looking at the audio timeline spikes when button presses were heard. I'm also testing this on the latest Xbox version update, which is 1.0.0.2. It's about as scientific as I'm going to get, but don't take it as gospel. My findings are the input delay has been reduced, probably with a mixture of software updates and by using a better monitor. I was surprised to see the wired controller versus the wireless controller was so close. I don't really think it's worth being tethered to your console to get better results. I decided while editing this portion of the video to go play some more Mortal Kombat 4 on the Legacy Collection to see if I notice any better performance. I think overall the game feels more playable with a higher refresh rate monitor and the newest patch. Keep that in mind if you want the best experience. Let's talk about the lighting in the Legacy Collection. Lighting seems to be the game's biggest shortcoming visually. This was a big issue in the MAME emulation as well. I'd say the Legacy Collection has done a better job than MAME in this department, but let's look at some of the examples where it's not working quite as well. The intro is a great example. Notice the floor of the arcade version is dark, and when the lightning strikes, it brightens. We do see the lightning on the floor in the Legacy Collection, but the floor is still too brightly lit at all times. The next example of lighting issues is the prison stage with the large fan in the back. The Legacy Collection just looks darker and more bland. On the other hand, the arcade version looks to have bright overhead lights, while the Legacy Collection is dark and brown. It's almost like the Legacy Collection is missing a lighting feature on that stage altogether. Beyond the lighting stuff, there may be something up with the floor textures. Some stages look perfectly normal, but the living forest looks heavily pixelated. This could just be the fact that it's CRT versus LCD, but it still looks overly pixelated to me. Another one in the odd glitch department is Raiden's electricity. In the arcade it stays tight against his body, but on the Legacy Collection it gets a little excited and starts shooting away from his hands. It's almost like the electricity on his torso is moving away from his body. It's kind of strange. One last indication of a lighting issue is the continue screen. The character falls down this well-lit hole that slowly darkens as you near the bottom. However, the bottom cannot be seen as they're falling. Instead, it's kind of shadowed and looks like a bottomless pit. On the Legacy Collection, the light is low in one brightness level throughout, and we can see a black circle at the bottom. This issue existed in MAME as well. The MAME emulation had what looked like a black circle with a burst of light texture on it. Now let's look at the physics of the Legacy Collection. Falling objects and even the rain seem a little strange in the Legacy Collection. The first time I noticed the rain issue was in the intro, and I know we've seen this a couple times throughout this video, so we're going to look quickly one more time. The rain is acting as if there's a huge wind blowing extra hard in the Legacy Collection. I also noticed there seems to be less rain in general. It's going to be really hard to prove that one as well, but if you just look at them for a little while, you can see there seems to be more rain on the arcade version. More evidence that the physics might be a little off when emulated is Rico's Chinese star move. When that move is blocked, it causes them to scatter in a relatively predictable but random looking pattern in the arcade. On the Legacy Collection, they scatter too far at times and fall in ways that don't seem consistent with the arcade physics. Jarek's special move really shows this as well. It rarely lands on screen in the Legacy Collection. Instead, it flies off out of the frame or even clips through the stage walls. Weapons are another anomaly in the Legacy Collection. In the arcade, they typically fall near where they were knocked out of the player's hand. In some cases, they will bounce to the left or right a little bit. In the Legacy Collection, they often bounce far off from where they were dropped and eventually can end up outside of the stage walls. I'm not saying this can't happen on the arcade, but there's clearly something going on with the physics in the Legacy Collection. Well, that's pretty much everything I could find wrong with the Legacy Collection's emulation, and again, it's not really that big of a deal because almost none of this affects the gameplay too terribly. They have fixed a glitch that I didn't even mention that I have talked about in the past. It's the run-through glitch. If you were on the right side of the screen, you could run through your opponent who was on the left side, and they have patched that with this newest update, thankfully. And overall, it makes the gameplay a lot better, so good job on that, Digital Eclipse. There was one other thing I was going to mention, and I cut it last minute. So I am just going to talk about it briefly. I think there might be something weird about the blood, and this may relate to the whole falling objects issue with the emulation of MK4. I feel like there is less blood when you do uppercuts, and I feel like there's less blood when you do roundhouses, and I think the blood falls weird in general in some cases. Like Scorpion's spear hits the body, it comes out in a strange pattern at the lower part of the blood spray. The arcade blood spray just shoots upward and out, and it falls very uniformly. On the Legacy Collection, you have a few stray drops near the bottom that just kind of spray out funny and they don't fall normally. This is not important at all. I just wanted to mention it in case somebody thought I missed it. Speaking of things I might have missed, let me know in the comments if you think I did miss something, and if there is something big enough to go back, or if there's a couple things big enough to go back and make a follow-up to this video, I will. But as far as I can tell, I think I've gotten pretty much everything I found worth talking about. And by worth talking about, I mean not that big of a deal. This game is 100% playable. It's getting better with updates. I do not want people thinking I'm hating on Digital Eclipse. I know I said that in the beginning of the video, but I just want to reiterate that in case people skip that part. Yes, I know this is all nitpicky stuff, but this is what the video is for. You guys wanted me to look at my arcade cabinet, tell you what was different, and here it is. But overall, the game is running pretty well, and I think it will continue to get better with updates. Let's hope Digital Eclipse updates the online stuff more. I haven't even had a chance to get into an online match since this recent update. I'm hoping we get lobbies soon. I'm hoping we get a bunch of new stuff added to it, because that's what I really cared about. I have the arcade game. I don't need to buy this to play the game. I wanted it to be good for the people who don't have Mortal Kombat for the arcade game, and I wanted it to maybe give people a chance to try MK4 again. I know a lot of people wrote it off long ago, but I love the game, and I've been trying for the last like 6 years on the channel to talk people into giving Mortal Kombat 4 another chance. I think it's a fun game. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. If you're watching the video, I have a suspicion you kind of like MK4, but we'll see. All right, this video took forever to put together, and I gotta go take a break. So thank you guys so much for watching. Subscribe if you're new. Leave me a comment. Let me know what you think, and I'll see you guys on the next video.